Hello, juniors, and welcome to yet another in a series of video lectures on interpersonal skills that you will need as you work in your career as a social worker. So today we're going to spend some time talking about some of the basics of anger management. Anger management is a very important skill to learn for yourself in terms of how you manage your own anger, as well as it'll be a necessary tool to help you understand the angers that clients and others that you may encounter will experience, as well as this also provides you some format of being able to actually teach some of these particular skills to the clients that you will be working with. So, again, we will talk about anger management. So first and foremost, what we're going to attempt to accomplish today is we want to spend a little bit of time talking about what anger actually is. And there is a process chain that we have developed that really helps us take a look at the entire process, do a little bit of exploration around what causes people to feel angry and then subsequently act aggressively, as well as provide some techniques to reduce anger and aggression. What is anger? As we think about that, it's a broad question. And for the purpose of our learning on today, we have a very simple definition for anger that we'll talk about. And it's what is there on the screen. Anger is an emotional response to another emotion. So what it says in essence is anger is very seldom about what we see, but it's more about what we experience. Anger has also been dubbed as what we call a surface emotion. It's the emotion that people are the most comfortable, oftentimes, given situations, actually sharing. And so we'll talk about an example. And so if we do a little bit of critical analysis and thinking about things that we see that might cause us to be angry or become angry or things that we experience, let's look at what really happens when we're dealing with an angry situation that we find ourselves involved in. So let's say that you are in a situation where a person who you know and maybe have had a relationship with, maybe not that great a relationship with, somehow becomes or for some reason becomes angry with you and walks up to you and actually shoves you. So if we take a moment and analyze that particular situation, what is it that might cause you to respond angrily? And if we look at it, it wasn't necessarily the act of being shoved or having your physical space violated. It was more about what does it mean for you as an individual to have your space violated in that particular fashion, or the notion that what this person is conveying is very little regard for your safety and well-being. And these might be the things that might cause us to have this emotional response and then act out in a very angry way. So that's just a really short example of how the anger process plays itself out, or what that emotional response to another emotion. So the other emotion would be the shame or the embarrassment or the frustration that's felt by actually having someone physically accost you. So when we start to think about this process, we do it best, and the easiest way to look at what typically happens with anger is this. You have what we call an external trigger. And an external trigger is nothing more than a set of circumstances, persons, places, situations that actually start this process in motion. You'll see the next drop down box on the chain is the internal trigger. So the difference between the external trigger and the internal trigger is the external trigger are those situations that happens outside of you that we often have very little control over. The internal trigger is your ability to actually assign meaning to what the external trigger was. And so again, if you're in a situation where someone physically assaults you or threatens you, that's the external trigger. Your interpretation of what that particular threat means to you in the context of your own being is the internal trigger. So it might work something like I was pushed by this particular person. My internal trigger or my thought process was that this person really doesn't like me or doesn't respect me. And now I move into the third step of the anger process chain, which is cues, which is the body's actual physiological response to stress and or anger. So as your body starts to prepare to respond to the actual threat that it actually now has deemed appropriate. And then typically in those situations, we then move right into a response. So again, those things that I just talked about in terms of the external triggers, those internal triggers, and then the cues in a little bit more detail. So this particular slide outlines those definitions and actually brings them to light, so I'll let you study them for just a little bit to get a better understanding of how that actually might play itself out. So now the key in terms of learning to manage your anger is really about managing time. And so again, what we're trying to do in this skill series is to help you understand the process. We just talked about the external trigger, the internal triggers, and the cues that, and then people typically will respond. But again, managing anger is about managing time. So the more time that you can put between the actual experience of the cues, or when your body starts to show those physiological responses to stress or anger, the more that you can do to actually increase the amount of time between that and your response, the better off you will be in terms of being able to manage your anger. And so you can see we're talking here about self-talk and anger reducers. And so the next slide really talks a little bit about what a self-talk is. And we do it all the time. We do it to ourselves when we're faced with various situations. You know, if you're in the car, you're driving on the freeway, someone cuts you off, you might say to yourself in the context of your own mind and your own thoughts, I'm just going to calm down today. I'll get to the location when I get there. Yes, I'm running late, but leaning on the horn, blowing, driving dangerously through traffic is really not going to help things. So I'm going to give myself permission, and I'm going to remind myself that I need to calm down and slow down. So that is the first step in terms of looking at adding to that time sequence that we were talking about in terms of managing your anger. So again, self-instructional statements that are basically intended to lower your level of arousal. The next thing we want to do after we've got some attention as it relates to having bought a little bit more time in terms of being aware of the situation and aware that we need to respond is being able to identify your personal cues. So your cues, and then actually implementing the use of anger reducers. So your cues basically are your body's response to anger. So it's what lets you know when you're angry. So if you had to describe it and think about it, it would be thinking about the last time that you found yourself very, very angry. Think about and describe what it was your body was doing and what you felt like. Some people often talk about increased respiration. Some folks get sweaty. Some people have this sensation of heat. I've heard things like the hair on the back of your neck stands up. Some people are unable to articulate their words. So those are cues that let you know that you're becoming more and more unmanageable. And those are things that you will also look for in terms of when you're dealing with clients who might be angry as well. So first of all, being able to know what your actual cue is. What is your body doing? What do you feel like when you're at that point of moving towards no return? And then finally, you want to actually, once you've recognized that piece, the goal is to not get there as often as you possibly can. So there are 3 simple anger reducers that we utilize, and it could be deep breathing. So deep breathing, the act of concentrating for maybe 10 seconds on breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth and not saying a word, actually can calm you down and slow the body's response to stress and anger down. Counting backwards, we've all heard the notion of when you get angry, just count to 10. And you see people that will count to 10 and then haul off and do something angry anyway. But if you were to look at, say, counting backwards from 20 to 1, it's different because there's a certain amount of mental energy that is required to actually figure out what number comes next, because it's not a sequence that we're typically used to working with. And so the actual 20 seconds that you can buy yourself by counting backwards, because you have to spend time concentrating on what number comes next, will actually be time that you can actually start to diffuse yourself and move away from the situation. The last one is pleasant imagery. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we might not be able to actually do some of those particular things, or if I'm a captive audience, for example. So if I'm sitting across the table with a group of folks who may not be happy with me, and we're having a meeting and they're talking to me about those pieces, I might be able to actually look at doing pleasant imagery. So while I'm listening to the conversation that might be at hand, I might also be thinking about being in the woods and actually doing some deer hunting, or being on a beach in Hawaii at my last vacation, and really thinking about being in a different place, even though I'm physically in the place that I am dealing with the situations that are at hand. So when we're looking at anger control, again, if we want to think about this is what we're actually shooting for. It's about really utilizing time in an effective way and very simple skills to actually move us from a place of a high level of arousal, anger, and stress to one of a lower one. And so the final chain or anger process chain would look like an external trigger, an internal trigger, started by your cues, your body starting to respond, then talking with yourself or self-talk, then utilizing one of the anger reducers, and then looking at a skill like problem solving or negotiation, and then responding to the situation that is at hand, and then evaluating whether that response was a response that garnered you what you needed to resolve the situation. So again, the anger management pieces are really about time management, and so it is often always in our best interest to really look at it in that particular way. So as you are interfacing with people who are a part of your life, people who are in your family, co-workers, clients that you will eventually work with as social workers, it is important to recognize the signs of anger and actually know what to do to keep yourself out of a bad situation and be able to transfer that knowledge on to others. Thank you again for your time and attention during this series, and I will see you in class.